Screams echoed through the corridors long before sunrise. Iron doors slammed shut again and again. A woman cried alone inside a dark room, while orderlies dragged a man across a wet concrete floor. The smell of chemicals mixed with sweat and mold filled the air. Patients stared silently at peeling walls as if something inside them had already disappeared. Some whispered meaningless phrases to themselves. Others remained completely motionless for days at a time. Outside those walls, the world carried on normally, but behind them, thousands of people slowly vanished from reality. And maybe the most terrifying question was not what happened inside those institutions, but why so many people believed it was treatment. It was the early 1900s. Psychiatric hospitals were rapidly expanding across the United States and Europe. Governments funded massive institutions built far away from major cities. Doctors promised cures for illnesses no one truly understood. Depression, anxiety, epilepsy, trauma, addiction, and even behavior considered unusual could send someone into those buildings, in many cases with little chance of ever leaving. What makes it even more disturbing is that the world at the time seemed to be advancing at incredible speed. Cities were growing rapidly. Skyscrapers were beginning to dominate American skylines. Railroads connected entire states. Electricity illuminated streets once consumed by darkness. Medicine was making historic discoveries. Society believed it was entering a new era of scientific progress and rational thinking. And it was during that very moment that some of the most quietly brutal places of the 20th century were born. Urban life was changing everything. Millions of people left rural communities to work in factories. The pace of city life became overwhelming. Endless workdays, extreme poverty, and psychological isolation began affecting entire populations. But mental illness was still viewed as shameful. Families hid relatives considered unstable. Emotionally distressed women could be institutionalized for hysteria. War veterans suffering from trauma were labeled weak. Children with neurological disorders were treated as dangerous. Then came the giant psychiatric hospitals built far from urban centers, places constructed on isolated hills surrounded by forests, snow, or empty fields. From a distance, they looked like elegant universities or European castles, but inside, the reality was very different. At first, many doctors genuinely believed they were creating spaces for healing and recovery. The idea sounded modern and compassionate. Patients would live away from crowded industrial cities, surrounded by silence and nature. But the number of patients grew far too quickly. Hallway became overcrowded. Rooms built for 2 people soon held 8 or 10. Food quality declined. Staff disappeared. Neglect arrived slowly, almost unnoticed. In institutions like the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, thousands of people spent decades living almost completely forgotten. Some never even received a clear diagnosis. Sometimes behavior considered inappropriate was enough to send someone away. Women viewed as too independent, immigrants who could not speak English, people suffering from trauma, elderly patients with dementia, young adults struggling with severe depression. As time passed, treatments became increasingly aggressive. Ice baths, straitjackets, heavy sedation. Patients spent hours restrained to metal beds. In some hospitals, people were subjected to electroshock therapy without proper anesthesia. In others, doctors believed removing parts of the brain could calm dangerous behavior. Lobotomies spread rapidly in the decades that followed, promoted as miracle procedures. Many patients survived, but they returned emotionally empty, unable to recognize loved ones or function normally. Fear of insanity slowly infected society itself. Newspapers described psychiatric hospitals as necessary to protect the public. Films and sensational stories exaggerated violent behavior. Over time, anyone considered different could become suspicious. Families hid relatives to avoid public shame. In many cases, patients disappeared entirely from social records, as if they had never existed at all. Inside the hospitals, conditions continued to deteriorate. Overcrowding transformed wards into human warehouses. Constant silence was interrupted only by breakdowns, crying, and distant screams during the night. Some patients spent years without receiving a single visitor. Others no longer remembered how long they had been institutionalized. Exhausted nurses began treating human beings like numbers. In certain hospitals, deaths became so common that burials happened without proper identification. But the collapse did not remain confined to the institutions themselves. Small towns surrounding these hospitals became economically dependent on them. Farms produced food for thousands of patients. Trains transported people constantly between states. Cemeteries expanded around forgotten facilities. Meanwhile, the rest of the world continued celebrating industrial growth and economic progress. In the decades that followed, disturbing reports finally began to emerge. Undercover journalists exposed overcrowded corridors, malnourished patients, and inhumane treatment methods. Photographs revealed people sitting motionless, staring into empty space. Public shock slowly grew, yet many hospitals continued operating for decades despite the outrage. When the system finally began to collapse, it was not because society had defeated cruelty. It was because those institutions became impossible to sustain. Costs increased, public criticism intensified. New psychiatric medications slowly replaced older violent methods. Gradually, enormous hospitals were abandoned one after another. But the world that emerged afterward was permanently changed. Mental health treatment evolved dramatically. Human rights became a more serious conversation. Society slowly began understanding that psychological suffering was not a sign of evil or weakness. Even so, many old stigmas survived. And perhaps that is what makes this story so unsettling today. Those hospitals were not created by pure evil alone. Many were founded by people convinced they were helping others. The danger began when fear, authority, and dehumanization started working together behind closed doors. Today, the empty corridors of those institutions still exist. Some remain abandoned, consumed by rust, mold, and silence. Others have become museums, but all of them carry the same haunting question echoing through their walls. How many times has humanity mistaken control for care? Because looking into the past was never just about revisiting ruins. It has always been a way of seeing what may still be happening right in front of us.